Breakfast with Disaster, where we tell you about all the worst things that can possibly happen so that you know how to avoid them. How do I know about them? It's not because I'm a sick freak. It's because I work for ServPro. Right here. Wait. There. Camera's flipped. And we're the people who help people to pick up the pieces after terrible things happen. And I want to talk today about kind of a heavy topic. It sounds like a Pink Floyd album or something. Water and time. The connection between those two things. Combined, water and time have done some of the most incredible things on this earth. And you may be familiar with them. This is the Grand Canyon, I believe. You've got glaciers. These things are basically water and time frozen in ice moving across, cutting valleys, fjords, etc. Looks like I'm missing a picture there. Water and time, over millions of years, do pretty incredible things. We're not talking about millions of years today, though. We're talking about the course of about a month. And why are we talking about a month in particular? Because it's been about a month since Winter Storm Elliott. You may have seen me. This is the clip I accidentally just teased a couple weeks ago on WGRZ talking about this very topic, which was a lot of fun. And Kevin Sylvester was very nice. And I told a story about the truck that I'm holding in that picture that I basically made up on the spot, so unfortunately I did lie on the news. But I was talking about Winter Storm Elliott, and we're about a month out from Winter Storm Elliott, and this was a big deal here in Western New York. For the obvious reasons, of course, that there was so much damage, there was so much tragic loss of life, there was so much disruption to what we do. But for me in particular, as someone who works at ServPro, this was unprecedented, and I've talked about it before, but just the sheer cold, the wind, and also the human elements of like the driving ban, things like that, just led to so much property damage, specifically bursting pipes, bursting sprinkler heads. As they got too cold to function, they popped and flooded buildings, and a lot of times people couldn't get to those buildings to really deal with it, and the damage was pretty severe. So let's fast forward today. It's about a month later. It's still kind of gloomy out. Thankfully, there's not 6 feet of snow on the ground anymore, but what's the current status a month out, and how bad is it? The answer is still pretty rough. That water that came down from those burst pipes and sprinkler heads, in a lot of cases, has not really been dealt with. We're still fielding dozens of phone calls every day from people who haven't dried their structures out. Maybe they were waiting for their insurance claims to clear, stuff like that. And we're still just dealing with the sheer volume of the projects that came through. There's a lot of people who really have not properly dealt with yet that water. So it's been sitting there for about a month. And we're talking about time in water damage mitigation. A month is a long time. It's an eternity. So I want to go into a little bit of detail into what that actually means to you at home, and especially people who had that damage. What can happen in the course of a month, and why is this such a long timeline for something like water damage? Let's talk about the water damage itself, the actual water. So when we go on water projects, we use a system of classification based on categories. And those categories refer to different levels of contamination in the water. And I didn't come up with this. We get trained on this. The Institute of Inspection, Cleaning, and Restoration Certification, their S500, their standard for water damage, speaks to this quite a bit. But they say there are basically 3 categories of water that you can use as shorthand to describe how contaminated that water is. You've got level 1, category 1, and that's basically clean water. That's the example I usually use is like your toilet supply line. And nobody would want to really drink out of that, but you could. You wouldn't get sick. It's basically clean. Category 2 is somewhat contaminated. A good example of that is like a dishwasher leak. That dishwasher's got soap and grime in it. It's not as contaminated as level 3, which we'll get to in a second, but you wouldn't want to drink it. You'd probably get sick. And then there's category 3, and this is grossly contaminated. This is your sewage, an aquarium where fish have been pooping. We talked about the aquadom not that long ago. Something like that would probably be considered category 3. Maybe that water ran through toxic building materials. Maybe it was flood water that ran along the ground through a house, picked up a lot of debris on the way. There are a lot of ways that water can become category 3. And the protocols for dealing with these different categories of water are pretty different. When you're dealing with category 1 water, there's a lot more you can do to save materials, save content, save people's homes, save people's stuff, because you're basically able to extract, dry that material. Especially if you get to it quickly, you stand a pretty good chance of saving and salvaging quite a bit. When you get to category 3, it's a totally different ballgame. you're talking about significant levels of contamination in porous materials, your drywall, your carpet, etc., that probably cannot be cleaned and sanitized to any sort of reasonable standard and might be compromised to begin with. It's a totally different project. There's different levels of PPE involved when you're dealing with Category 3 as opposed to Category 1. And the reason I bring that up in this context, this month-long timeline that we're talking about, is that water does not stay Category 1 for very long. If it's been released into the environment, if it's out of your pipe, water kind of naturally attracts contamination. It's a great breeding ground for bacteria, even insects. If you've ever walked by a puddle and seen a bunch of mosquitoes in there, it just naturally attracts debris from the air, it traps it in there. Water becomes contaminated very, very easily and very, very quickly. And the timeline on that, according to the IACRC, who again writes the standard, is about 72 hours. Water is constantly moving towards more contamination. And they say within 72 hours, that Category 1 water, that clean water, should be treated as Category 3, which means it's grossly contaminated as sewage, just because of the sheer amount of contamination that breeds within that water as it sits. And we'll talk about types of contamination in a second here, but I'm sure you're thinking of a big one starting with the letter M. But it can really be all sorts of things. And let's get into that big M. I actually am going to call it SMG, and this is sort of an industry term. It means suspect microbial growth. And, this stuff. Say in this corner, I've got to call it SMG, and that's because of New York State law. I am not a certified mold assessor. I'm a mold remediator. You cannot be both on a project. And so I've sort of thrown my hat into the remediation ring. And since I'm not an assessor, I'm not technically qualified to say if this blue gross stuff in the corner here is mold or not. I've got to call it SMG, suspect microbial growth. This is one of the things that people get the most concerned about when it comes to water damage and moisture in their home, and rightfully so. When we're talking about time windows, though, again, we're a month out from a lot of these initial events. How long does it take to get something like this gross blue stuff growing in your home? The window that I generally use and generally advise people on is about 72 hours. Within that 72-hour window, that's when you're going to start to see if there's elevated levels of moisture, and if there's something for that mold to eat, that's when you're going to start to see visual growth. And mold is not super picky. And in fact, there are documents like FEMA actually says 24 to 48 hours that say that timeline's even less. But if you've got moisture in there and you've got something for that mold to eat, which can be anything organic. It can be your drywall, your books, a cardboard box. We've seen mold SMG growing on an easy chair that somebody sat in for 30 years, and their skin flakes are there, and it grows in the shape of a person. It's very gross. There's plenty in your house or your business for SMG to grow on. And if you let that water sit for, again, in my book, I generally say about 72 hours. Some people say shorter timelines. You're likely to see it start to form visually. And that can be pretty scary for people when they start to see black snot on the walls, is the example that was used in my water certification class. But there's all sorts of different levels of microbial growth. And that's not a guarantee, by the way. It can be pretty tricky. But generally, if you've got the water, microbial growth, SMG, is pretty soon to follow. And again, that's 72 hours. So when we're talking about a month after this initial water event, you better believe that there's plenty of this out there forming right now. We've seen it on projects that we're working on. I'm sure there's plenty more that maybe people aren't aware of, they haven't dealt with, that we're going to see soon. And so, again, for the insurance agents, property managers watching, I would kind of be ready for that in February into March, especially as maybe it gets a little warmer. You might start to get those calls of, hey, I've got something growing in my basement or my living room. Is this covered? And in my experience, when you get a call that late, it often isn't. And one of the reasons that it isn't is because of this next point I'll make, which is about insurance. So again, we're talking about timelines, right? We're talking about a month out from that initial water event. And if the IACRC is to be believed and FEMA are to be believed, these sources of knowledge for us, that's way after the really effective timeline to mitigate, that 72-hour window before microbial growth starts to form, before that water becomes Category 3. You're way past that. So how does that affect your insurance coverage if you've waited or been forced to wait a month or more to start to deal with your water damage problem, which believe me, we see quite often. And the reason why, by the way, and I'll say, I'm not licensed as any sort of insurance professional. This is purely anecdotal. But the reason that we see people wait that long is because they think they're being savvy. They think they're being smart. They have either waited until their insurance adjuster has come out and assessed the damage and rendered a coverage decision and given them the go ahead so that they can move forward, or maybe they think they're going to get 3 estimates from people to deal with this water damage, like they're a government entity or something, and they're going to work these companies against each other. Or maybe they really think, and this is a pretty common thing that people assume, that if they touch that water at all, that damage at all, before the adjusters come out and render the coverage decision, that it will somehow eliminate their ability to get covered. It will totally screw with their coverage decision. And that can be kind of a dangerous myth. And the reason why is pretty simple. Insurance carriers expect their insureds to act reasonably when damage happens. And one of the clauses in most insurance policies, and the language can vary, but there's a duty there on the insured to mitigate damages as best as they can. And the reason is this. Your insurance carrier has agreed, it's part of your policy, to cover damages that were determined by the damage event. So your burst pipe, your burst sprinkler head, whatever. They've agreed to cover that. That's part of the relationship that you have with them. But conversely, they will not cover any damage that could have been averted with what they usually call ordinary prudence. Any reasonable activity that you could have taken to limit damage or secondary damage after the initial event has happened, if they can prove that you haven't taken reasonable steps, all or part of that claim could be denied. And we see this happen quite a bit when people wait, or they don't want to deal with something, or they think they're being savvy, and they go through all of the rigmarole of getting an insurance adjuster out there to walk around and take pictures before they actually take any steps to mitigate. It can actually endanger their ability to get covered, which is a little bit ironic considering most people do it because they think it's going to help. They think that it's going to prevent them from having to pay out of pocket. Honestly, more often than not, the opposite is true. I'm bringing this up because, again, this timeline, and because a lot of folks who watch this are insurance agents, and I hope they're giving people the best advice that they can. When something happens, especially when water damage happens, that timeline starts immediately. That clock starts ticking. And you really need to start dealing with that water as soon as you can, and certainly within that 72-hour time frame, before that water becomes grossly contaminated, before potential SMG starts to grow visually. Those things can, A, really complicate the process and turn it into a much bigger project, but B, if you are found to not have taken prudent steps to protect yourself, to limit that damage, it can also endanger your claim. So I understand that insurance is scary. Water damage is scary. It's something most people maybe deal with once in their lives, and there's not a lot of guidance on how to deal with it. So this is me, I guess, trying to help. Deal with it as best you can. And I'm not even saying you have to call ServPro. I would certainly love it if you did. But take steps to protect yourself. Take steps to protect your property. Deal with it reasonably and document everything along the way. And you're going to be in much better shape in most cases than if you waited a month and then call and have to try to deal with everything after the fact. That can be pretty ugly. So that's our show for today. Water in time. Beautiful thing. When it happens over millions of years and forms beautiful Grand Canyons and coyote arches out in Arizona, glaciers, everything. In the course of a month inside of a house, totally different. Very, very, very dangerous to sit on that for a month, and I would advise you not to do it. Let's draw our prize, and if you guys have never done this before, it's very simple. Here's my prize wheel. Everybody who's in the ServPro Mug Club has a number on this wheel, and if they're watching and I call their number, they will get a double prize. The only way for me to know that you're watching is if you leave me a comment, so please do so as I give this guy a spin so I know you're there. And we're working on getting those prizes out, by the way. I talked to Chris, so you guys know, about running a lot of those out that we're a little bit late on. Who we got today? 687, newbie. All right. That's Leslie over at the Messy Agency. So, Leslie, if you're watching, shoot us a comment. If not, we will shoot out there regardless and get you your prize. I'll be back next week with another edition of Breakfast with Disaster, where we talk about all sorts of, excuse me, wonderful, terrible things. Would love it if you join me. I'm Dan Bauer for Serve Pro, and I'll see you later.